leave your country, your people, and your household, and go to a land I will show you.
Today we are wrapping up our series, Finding the Promised Land. My hope is that the conversation we have shared over the past few weeks has helped give you some ideas about how we can better prepare our church to become part of the promised land God has in store for the generations that come after us. I've been looking forward to today's message because it takes one of the most familiar stories in our faith history and interprets it in a way that will be new for many, if not most of us. More importantly, by understanding the story in this way, we will discover that it offers some great insight into how we can overcome some of the challenges we face in making sure that our church and our faith remain vital for generations to come. The story I'm talking about is David and Goliath. My guess is that most of you are at least somewhat familiar with it. It is found in 1 Samuel 17. And is the story of a young boy named David who enters battle with a much larger, more seasoned soldier named Goliath. For the most part, this story has been interpreted as one of the greatest underdog stories in human history. How could a little shepherd boy defeat a giant soldier that everyone else in the Israelite army was afraid to face? But what if that interpretation of the story misses a larger point? What if this isn't an underdog story at all? What if David had the upper hand all along? That's what author Malcolm Gladwell argues in his book, David and Goliath: Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. What I'll be talking about today is based on his argument, and I'll be curious to see what you think of this new reading of an ancient story. The action takes place in the Elah Valley. Here is a map of that area. Moving to the east along this path was the Philistine army. The Elah Valley was in the area near the tip of that arrow. The Philistines' goal in moving east was to capture this area of the map and split the kingdom of Israel in two. Now, this Philistine army was no joke. They were battle-tested and tough. When Saul heard they were coming, he gathered his troops to defend their homeland. The battle lines were set up in this area right here, and here's a modern-day picture of it. The Philistines were on one side of this valley, the Israelites were on the other. Since any attack would mean an army had to descend into that valley, that would mean they would give up high ground and then have to fight their way back uphill. Because of that, both armies dug in. Trying to break the stalemate, the Philistines sent down their greatest warrior into the valley to challenge Israel to a one-on-one battle, champion against champion. To the victor goes the spoils. The Philistine champion was Goliath. Scripture tells us he was 6 cubits tall, which is about 10 feet. Whether that description was for dramatic effect or true, the point is that the man was huge. He was also decked out in armor from head to toe, in the very best armor that you could get, and he carried weapons to match. For 40 days, the giant entered the valley and taunted the Israelites. For 40 days, every Israelite soldier remained too afraid to face him. While all of this was happening, a man named Jesse, who had multiple sons in the Israelite army, had prepared some supplies for the soldiers. He loaded up those supplies and told his youngest son, David, to deliver them to the front line. When David got there and saw the situation, he asked what was going on. Upon hearing about Goliath and his challenge, David volunteered for the job. Everyone thought he had lost his mind. King Saul tried to stop him, saying he was just a boy. But David said something that is very important. In fact, it is the key to Gladwell's argument about how this story should be interpreted. David explained that he was a shepherd, and that he was able to fend off lions and bears who tried to attack his flock. While Saul and the others doubted him, David was confident he could win this fight. He never saw himself as the underdog. And so Saul agrees. But first, he demands that David suit up in protective armor, which he does, but it is so heavy and awkward that David cannot even walk. So he sheds the armor and instead takes 5 smooth stones and places them in a pouch. He then went into the valley to face the giant. When Goliath saw the boy, he was offended that they would send such a dog to the fight. David shouted back that God does not save by sword and spear alone, and that he would kill Goliath before the day was done. And the fight was on, but it did not last long. As soon as Goliath began to move toward him, David ran at him, and taking a stone from his pouch and putting it in a sling, he struck the giant in the forehead, knocking him to the ground. David then ran to the man and, taking the giant's own sword, cut off his head to finish the job. When the Philistines saw their giant had fallen, they fled in fear, and David's legend began to grow. And the legend is still told today. In fact, it has grown to become an almost universal metaphor for improbable victories. But as Gladwell points out in his book, this is where we might be getting the story wrong. Here's why. Ancient armies were primarily made up of 3 kinds of warriors. Cavalry and infantry were the first 2. The third group was made up of projectile warriors, archers, and most importantly for our conversation today, slingers. Slingers had a leather pouch connected to a long rope. They would put a rock or other projectile in the pouch and swing it in a circle until it came to the desired speed, at which time they would release one side of the rope, sending the projectile on its way. It took a lot of skill, but once mastered, it was incredibly effective. Here's an ancient drawing showing a slinger striking a bird in mid-flight. In the Old Testament book of Judges, slingers are praised for their accuracy. An experienced slinger could be within a hair's breadth of their target from up to 200 yards. They were basically the ancient world's equivalent of a modern-day sniper. The Romans had even developed special tools to remove stones flung by slingers that had hit their soldiers. And there were multiple battles in ancient history determined by the efficacy of an army's slingers. Goliath was basically heavy infantry. He was trained and ready to fight hand to hand with an opponent. He was not equipped to fight a slinger. And what made him such a strong hand-to-hand fighter, his heavy armor, strength, and size, also made him an easy target for a slinger. Gladwell points out that once David began running toward Goliath with sling in hand, the battle was already over. It would have only taken seconds for David to sling the rock, not nearly enough time for Goliath to respond. The reality is most likely this. As soon as Goliath saw David pull out the sling, he knew he was in trouble. In the same way, everyone watching from both sides of the valley would have known it too. David was a slinger, and slingers would beat infantry every time. David had basically brought a gun to a knife fight. All those years guarding the flock, fending off lion and bear with a sling, had turned David into a deadly weapon. That is why David was so confident going into battle with Goliath. He knew he would win. David was not an underdog. He was an innovator. He did something no one saw coming. He changed the rules of the game. He used the wisdom he had been given by God to discern how his gifts could be used to protect his people and ensure their safety against an overwhelming force. And that is where we learn the greatest lesson from the story. Sometimes, when it comes to overcoming a challenge set before us, we have to open our eyes to see things differently, to look at the strengths we have been given, the gifts we have, and to maximize those things to achieve our goals. Here's another example found in Gladwell's book about how this can work. It is also one that hits pretty close to home around here, especially for those of you who are basketball fans. This is Vivek Ranadive. He is from Mumbai, India, and grew up playing cricket and soccer. But when he came to the US, he began to follow basketball. The more he watched it, the more puzzled he became by the fact that even though the rules allowed, most teams did not play defense using the full court. Instead, after scoring a basket, they would retreat to their own side of the court and wait for the other team to bring the ball down. This made little sense to Vivek. And so, when he began coaching his daughter's basketball team, he taught them to defend the entire court by using a full court press. One of the reasons he did that was because his team wasn't all that good. They weren't tall, couldn't shoot the ball very well, and their dribbling was weak. If they played conventional basketball, they would have lost a ton of games. They could not match strength against strength in the traditional way. So they focused on defense, and it worked. Vivek took his team all the way to the national finals, where they placed second in the country. His methods angered some, but he was well within the rules. He just changed the game to suit their strengths, and they won. This lesson was also learned the hard way by the University of Massachusetts. In 1971, they were the team to beat. Dr. J was their star, and they were awesome. They had not lost a home game in over 2 years until the night they played Fordham University, a big underdog. But Fordham did not try to match strength on strength. They went rogue. They played a full court press, and to everyone's surprise, they won. Sitting on the bench for the University of Massachusetts was a freshman named Rick Pitino. Pitino saw what happened, and he learned from it. At the age of 25, he began using the same approach while he was coaching at Boston University, and he was able to lead it to its first NCAA tournament. Then he took over at Providence College, and in his second year, he took a team that had a losing record the year before he arrived all the way to the national semifinals, just because he began using that full court press. The thing that confuses people like Gladwell is that this story plays out all the time. People get so used to doing things one way, the way that they think is the only way to do things. Then, even when they are confronted by a huge challenge, one they know will likely end poorly if they keep doing things the same old way, they go out there and try to stand toe-to-toe with a much more formidable foe. And inevitably, they lose. The rest of Gladwell's book talks about this tendency, giving example after example of how it plays out. It's an eye-opening study of missed opportunity and failure based on the fact that we struggle to do things in new and innovative ways, even if the way we've always done it isn't working anymore. For the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about the upcoming generations of faith. What we've learned is that younger generations admire our faith. They see a lot of great things in Christianity, and they really love the teachings of Jesus. The problem for them is with the people who claim to be Christians, but live in ways that don't reflect the love, grace, and compassion of Jesus. Young people are leaving the church not because of its teaching, but because of its people. In response to that truth, many churches have dug in their heels and said that these young folks just need to get on board. This is about tradition. This is how we've always done it, and they need to honor and respect that. On one level, I get that response. There are a lot of things we can honor and respect in the traditions of our church. At the same time, the modern church is facing its own Goliath when it comes to declining numbers, influence, and impact. This is especially true when it comes to younger generations. And so we have a choice. Do we keep trying to go toe-to-toe like many churches in our faith have been doing, even though every indicator says that doing so means certain decline? Or do we change the game? I don't know about you, but I'm ready to change the game. The stakes are too high for us to give up. While we need to honor the great things of our past, we also need to open ourselves to the possibility of a future where the church may look different, but is every bit, if not more effective than the church we know today. I believe deeply that God has a great future in store for the church, a promised land even better than the one in which we find ourselves. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to get there, and there might be moments it feels like we're wandering in the wilderness on the way. But I am convinced that the next generation of believers is to this challenge what David was to Goliath. Goliath never saw David coming. Neither did Saul or anyone else who was in power at the time. But once they trusted him and let him get into the game, the victory was won. Friends, I say we let our slingers loose. That we listen to and better trust the insights and intentions of the innovators in our midst. Together with their insights, strengths, and along with our experience and resources, the game is ours to win. And the promised land we hope for is much closer than you might imagine. Look, we are not the underdogs here. After all, just like David, we've got God on our side. And if we follow God's lead, we will find ourselves delivered into a new and even better promised land than we could ever imagine. I can't wait to see you there. Amen.